Good morning to all of you. I'm Mike Van Dusen, Deputy Director of the Woodrow Wilson Center. I want to welcome you. I guess last night there was a delay on the Beltway of about 95 minutes for people. Howard Wolpe is not on the Beltway. That's the good news. The bad news is he's still en route, and he'll be here momentarily. I just want to welcome you to this policy colloquium on preventing and rebuilding failed states amid the global economic crisis. As you know, we are a public-private institution. We get roughly 1/3 of what it needs to keep this place going from the federal government, and we raise 2/3. I consider this meeting to be very much in what we call the Wilsonian tradition. Woodrow Wilson is the only president we had who had a PhD. He was also a politician, and he was often frustrated by the nexus between politicians and scholars. He always felt in life that you've got to get the scholar out of his ivory tower and understand the practical problems of governance, and you have to get policymakers away from their inbox where all they can think about is a meeting next Thursday, and think 5-10 years out. And what you are doing today is getting the right people in the room to discuss a very important topic. Our idea today is we get this diverse group. Howard, are you all right?
Howard always steals the show.
Yeah, he certainly does. Hey, are you all right?
Oh, yeah. Just my pride.
Get a diverse group of people into the room, working in various agencies across the government, NGO world, think tanks, universities, interested in ways of achieving more effective policy to address failing, fragile, and failed states. There are just simply years of experience in this room, and I think it's very good for you to look at the lessons we've learned, look what's going to succeed, try and prioritize what needs to be done, and I look forward to hearing about the results of your work today. Howard, I want you now to introduce the work of the Leadership Project, what you're doing, and start this discussion. But again, many thanks for being here today, and we consider what you are doing to be extraordinarily valuable work and useful to many people inside and outside the government and worldwide.
Thanks, Mike.
I'm sorry.
And here
I have. Well, at least you're not on the belt.
Yeah, right. So, well, I'm delighted to join in welcoming everyone. I'm sorry for the bit more dramatic entrance than I anticipated. The Leadership Project was begun several years ago here at the Wilson Center, and emerged essentially out of my own experience as a diplomat and earlier as a policymaker in Congress, where I came away with a feeling that conventional approaches to peace building, to post-conflict reconstruction were rather flawed in that they seem to take a very institutionally sterile approach, kind of working sort of empirically backwards from understanding Western democratic institutions and thinking if we could somehow replicate those institutions, that you would end up with stable democratic societies. And so you had this kind of checklist approach. But never did we, in most peace-building activity across the world, there was seldom any serious effort to deal with the key leaders themselves, with their mindsets, with their perceptions of the world and of each other. And the notion that somehow just signing an agreement was a major step forward was, I think, absurd on its face, because that did not mean that the next day they saw each other any differently, or that they were any more prepared to deal with issues underlying their conflict. And so the World Bank had brought me on as a consultant to think about strategies of post-conflict reconstruction in the Great Lakes region of Africa. And we developed I put on the table with the bank a new kind of model suggestion that we try something very different in one of the most polarized of all societies, namely Burundi, to identify key leaders very strategically from all sectors, not just political, but military and civilian, and take these leaders through a long-term training program designed to do several things, but most fundamentally to try to begin to alter the mindset of the political world being a zero-sum game, winner take all, to help build some recognition of interdependence among leaders and a recognition that at the end of the day they would emerge stronger as a matter of self-interest through collaboration with others. We wanted to help rebuild the trust and the relationships that have been fractured by their conflict, to help rebuild a consensus on the rules of the game and how power is organized and power was shared. And finally, to help strengthen skills of communications and negotiations among key leaders so that they would be in a position to begin to put themselves in the shoes of the other and to begin to really focus on interest-based negotiations to identify means of solutions that would satisfy the interests of all. Well, we launched this program. We had some considerable success in Burundi. We were then invited to be in work elsewhere in Congo, Liberia. The World Bank asked us to design a program for East Timor. And then Michael Lund joined us, and we formed kind of a partnership to want to try to understand in a more academic fashion some of these connections between the kind of interactive process that we had launched in the Burundi case and that we then extended to other countries as well. To try to understand more fully, what works, what doesn't work, what are appropriate points of entries in different cultural and political contexts, what are missed opportunities sometimes, what are the key ways, what are the keys to success of allowing this kind of work to move forward. And that led to a project that we had support from the Ford Foundation on to take a look at half a dozen case studies of peace processes. We brought in, created a working group of trainers, diplomatic practitioners, and academic analysts. And for 2 years, we would meet periodically to review these case studies of peace processes and to do that kind of examination. These are all processes that had some form of interactive component or second track process joining with the more formal conventional diplomacy, and to see what lessons could be discerned from that. Michael and I are trying to put the finishing touches on a book shortly that will produce the final work product, which is basically a lessons learned distillation from that exercise. And then we moved from there to a different kind of consideration of trying to understand more fully how to create more integrative approaches within our respective governments across the world and international institutions to peace building, to post-conflict reconstruction. And so we've done a number of different kinds of things. The most notable one is using the DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo, as the focus, literally assembling, in the case of the Kinshasa, when we were there on one occasion, a mixed group of some donors. Here in the United States, a very top-level set of leaders from the various agencies that all had some relevance to the DRC, together with World Bank, UN, and other institutional leaders, to look at better ways of coordinating and collaborating together. So there's more coherence in the way the international community approaches peace-building, post-conflict reconstruction in a single country. We find that very seldom does that happen. I think you know that. And we were, in a sense, playing the role of third-party facilitator to bring together these various entities. And it's yielded some very exciting lessons, I think, for all of us who've been engaged in that process. And there's going to be a monograph on that work that'll be published shortly. And then finally, that leads us to really today's effort, which is again to really take a larger look at more cohesive, coherent ways of government coming together to deal with the general problem of failed states and failing states. It's a lot of literature, but it's not been accumulated. It's not necessarily been applied. A lot of research literature. So, and that's what we're hoping that will emerge from today's session, which brings together an awful lot of extraordinary experts and others to begin to see if we can pull out of this history some lessons that can be very useful as we move forward. So with that broad introduction, let me yield to Michael Lund, who will give you more specific content of today's program.
Thank you, Howard. Thanks for all you coming and your interest in this subject. Certainly failed states, state failure, weak states, and so on, came onto the agenda since 9/11, and a lot of discussion as to what they are, where they are, how to deal with them, and so on has been going on since that time. We're not going to. The reason why they've been seen to be so important is because of a variety of problems, ills, threats, and so on that they are seen to generate potentially. Most dramatically, of course, with the case of Afghanistan with Al-Qaeda and its nefarious acts on 9/11. Since that time, this whole theme of taking a whole-of-government approach to failing and failed states has really become a major focus in so many discussions, both in Europe and other capitals and in the United States, here in Washington. The idea that one needs to bring together the usually divorced notions of how to achieve security with how to achieve development, and somehow figure out some kind of way to synergize and collaborate among these professions and these types of programs. And that kind of issue is really coming up at so many different levels, all the way from how provincial reconstruction teams operate or should operate in Afghanistan, between civilian and military work and so on, all the way up to the question of should we reform our national security apparatus in the United States in order to be more adept at both identifying where states may fail, as well as responding to those situations. We're not going to dwell on the consequences that are very much, some presentations may touch on that are seen to issue often from this or that failed state, such as drug trafficking, terrorism, potential humanitarian crises, and so on. We're going to focus on what the meaning of this new discourse is, and what does it actually what can it look like in actual practice at these various levels? Obviously, a discourse talking about integrated holistic strategy comes up against the other major, one other major theme development, and that is, among others, the economic crisis and the squeezing of resources for international affairs in general. We've got a new administration that has a lot on its plate, domestically as well as in terms of foreign policy. We believe that fragile and failed states are potentially generating threats, so something needs to be done to address them. So the purpose of this event is to draw on what we know from research and be a little bit more intelligent, informed, and effective in pursuing this notion of creating synergy among the 3Ds, for example, defense, development, and democracy. A number of you were at an event about a month ago that others of you, I think, might be interested in hearing about briefly. The U.S. Marine Corps held a 5-day simulation of what was called a whole-of-government approach to conflict prevention. And they identified the Horn of Africa as a scenario. And the idea of the event, which involved about 200 people, was for them to role play representing various U.S. government agencies, NGOs, the World Bank, UN, multilateral organizations, as well as the host countries in the Horn of Africa, which was the focus, and then also some multinational partners of the U.S., such as the Italians, the French, the British, and so on. Swedes were there, and so on, Germans. We role-played for 5 days to figure out how we would interact with each other in addressing this potential threat. It was very much a focus on a situation before it blew up into a major crisis. And that was just reflective of the kind of thing that's going on in many, as I say, not just here in Washington, but in the development community, in Brussels, in London, Ottawa, other places, concerned with this notion of achieving more harmonization in development, for example, and linkage across the sectors that are usually organized in a very fragmented way. If there's anything that holism cannot mean, in order to be really value-added, strategic, and so on, and new and advanced, it can't be simply a new buzzword in which everybody goes about doing their own thing and joins the bandwagon under this sort of vague rhetoric. It can't mean doing everything, addressing every kind of problem in every situation, all the time and in every place. It has to mean some kind of economizing, some kind of cutting down, some kind of rationalizing of all this activity in order to be much more streamlined and effective. So what is the nature of that formula at the country level and at other levels? That's really the set of, or the problem we're looking at. And we're addressing it at several levels, 4 different levels. The first session asks about where the principal failing states are that may become failed states and therefore generate even more threats than they may already be generating, how to preempt the process of failure. And then in the second session, after the coffee break, we'll look at the country level and ask the question, what is a strategic way of prioritizing in rebuilding post-conflict states and in addressing fragile states that may be in some kind of transition away from authoritarianism into a somewhat more open, pluralistic system, if not necessarily democracy. And there's quite a bit of research on comparative research looking at many cases of each of these kinds of situations. And then we're going to move down to the sectoral level and address how to achieve 3 functions that are generally accepted as among the most important, particularly in post-conflict situations. And that is establishing a political leadership that is more or less seen as legitimate and can function more or less effectively, creating the capacity to deliver services, basic services like education and health to the general population, and then stimulating the economy so that jobs are available, income begins to rise, and so on. And the theme of those 3 sessions is really, that cuts across them, is really how, in fragile states environments, you have to deal with the situation in ways that are not typical of business as usual in more developed states, where you have at least some kind of capacity for delivering, for example, delivering services. You have to synthesize out of the situation something that can begin to achieve these functions. So the theme in all of those sessions is how to build upon the existing resiliencies in these societies in order to establish a real ownership of the process of rebuilding by local elites and by the population. Then finally, we turn to another level, and that is at the multilateral level. What are the capabilities that the U.S. government can draw on from other like-minded governments, from the UN, from the World Bank, and other multilateral organizations? Come on down and sit in the front if you'd like. And then after focusing on intergovernmental relations, U.S. relations with the multilateral system, we'll take it finally to Washington in a sense, and that is ask the question of how the U.S. government itself needs to be possibly reorganized and budget resources shifted from one function to others in order to actually achieve a more effective approach and strategic approach to failed states. So that's a quick tour of the program of the day. At the very end, and this is something to keep in mind as we go, we'd like to have a kind of bull session on what stand out as kind of the most interesting and important insights that you've gained from the day, and what are the kind of most critical practical implications for policy that came out of the discussions. So that's basically what we're up to here. We're drawing, in order to help us wend our way through these very important and quite and obviously very complex questions. We're drawing on people who've done research in each of these areas, and they will be the core and heart of the substance of the day. Are there any questions about what either of us have said so far, or about the logistics or anything like that at this point? I think maybe in my role as sort of the initial coordinator here, I should point out that the restrooms are around to the left. That's extremely important information. Okay. All right. So, Sarah, is there anything else we should mention, that we could mention at this point? Okay. The moderators, it's a very tight schedule, so we're going to kind of try to move quickly. The moderators will not provide background information on the speakers, which is developed very fully in the handout that you can get if you haven't at the table outside. Okay, so why don't we move to the first session? So you guys, why don't you guys sit here, and I'll go to the end. Except I have no way to control you sitting over here.
That's probably good news. Taser. You should have a taser. Get started, or are you going to introduce something?
Well, our first speaker is Jack Goldstone from George Mason University. The topic is in the program. I'm going to try to keep these fellows to about 10 minutes each. Somehow, maybe I'll have to stand up and tap them on the shoulder or something. And then, hopefully, if we stick by that, we can have a very vigorous discussion in response to what they're saying. So go ahead, Jack.
Thank you, Michael.
I'm here to kind of set the table and raise some issues, and I'll let my colleagues, both on this panel and throughout the day, give you the solutions. Now, I don't expect you to be able to read any of the detail in this table. I just put it up because it's a familiar kind of table these days. It's a ranking of countries around the world according to one estimate, in this case, the State Fragility Index developed by Monty Marshall and colleagues at George Mason University. And I'll read you just so you can get a flavor. The top 10 countries are Sudan, Afghanistan, Myanmar, Chad, Iraq, Rwanda, Democratic Republic of Congo. Even I can't read the next one. Burundi, Liberia. And this is based on 2007 data. One of the problems with all of these indices is it usually takes some time to collect the data and difficult to be in real time. What I want to point out is not the ranking, and there are many indices like this that more or less overlap in their rankings. They vary in detail. But I want to point out there has developed over the last few years quite substantial agreement on what are the main components of state fragility or ways to index it. And that is, there are basically four pillars: security, governance, economics, and provision of social services. Now, these are broken up in different ways by different organizations. Sometimes security is decomposed into military and civilian. Sometimes the issue of providing services is divided into social services, education services. It can be divided quite finely. The issue of governance is sometimes divided into whether or not you have an effective executive and legislature on the one hand, and whether you have an effective and capable rule of law, court, prison, police system, and so on. As I say, different people divide these in different ways for measurement purposes, and that's fine. What's important is that all four of these dimensions call out to be addressed in making assessments of state fragility and developing plans to cope with that fragility by preventing further decay or by rebuilding state and state authority in a situation where conflict has occurred and government has broken down. So in a sense, it's good that we have this broad agreement on these issues: security, governance, economics, and social services. But it creates the difficult problem of how do you go from those four abstract concepts of things we have to pay attention to and things that are desirable to develop to putting them in practice in a given country. And the reason for that is that fragile states are not all fragile in the same way. There are a number of different pathways by which governance declines and fragility develops. There may be an ethnic conflict in a country of greater or lesser severity. It may at extremes reach the point of genocide targeting a particular group. It may be that the government, instead of providing services and economic growth and security for the population, is only interested in providing economic wealth and security for the leaders, the predatory or crony state. There may be an ongoing guerrilla rebellion or acts of terrorism that disrupt order within the state and its territory. And although we often want to promote democracy as a solution to some of these problems, quite frequently democratic governments are themselves the source of state fragility when those governments are ineffective because of paralysis, deadlock, or corruption among the democratic parties or democratic leaders. There have been any number of states from Weimar Germany to Nepal where democracy has led to worse things because of the inability of the democratic government to carry out the required functions of a government regime. And it's also often the case, lastly, even if you have a government that has been working for a substantial period of time, if there is no clear succession for a well-established leader, or if you have a party government and the party suddenly collapses, the struggle for power in a succession crisis can often lead to conflict or very fragile governance. Now, given the variety of situations in states, when we talk about how do we address policy to dealing with fragility, I think it's crucial to try and establish what is the core problem. You will hear the terms legitimacy and effectiveness or capacity come up quite a lot today. Basically, legitimacy is the notion that a government should be, in its personnel and policies, deserving and capable of winning the support of a substantial portion of the population. Not everybody, but certainly enough to secure a functioning government and a society that is inclined to obey and support that government. Effectiveness is a separate issue, and that is whether the government has the resources and has the administrative capacity to carry out the tasks we expect of government. Can it control the security forces and indeed provide security? Can it monitor and regulate the economy and provide a stable framework in which economic growth occurs? Can it provide the type of services, education, infrastructure, waste disposal, health services that are necessary to provide for the well-being and growth of the population? And is it the case that the government itself is capable of coming to decisions, carrying them out? Is there a framework for local government? So in all these issues, is the government legitimate in how it was composed, how it took power, and in the policies it's carrying out? And is the government capable or effective in carrying out policies? Now, these two combine in different ways. You may have a legitimate state, but it is weak because it's lacking resources or the administrative or legal structure is faulty. And the core problem in this case is to help a legitimate state become effective. On the other hand, one may also find an effective state, that is, a government that may have a strong military, may have a strong central government authority, but it is not legitimate, either because it's undertaken policies on behalf of a particular group or on behalf of the leadership, it hasn't provided services. In a sense, the strong state needs reform, either in the process of selection of leaders or in the policies they carry out. If government is both illegitimate and weak or absent, that's a situation in which major state-building efforts are required. Conversely, one may have a strong and fairly legitimate state. It may be strong in some ways, but not others. For example, Pakistan has a fairly strong military. It has a legitimate government that was elected and has support of a majority of people throughout the country, but it is very weak in terms of providing economic growth and social services, and it is facing a substantial rebellion in a portion, but only a portion, of the territory of that state. So in assessing what needs to be done, what level of effort, what level of finance, what time framework for commitment, it's crucial to identify the core problem. And I'll simply close by saying it is a curiosity of much of U.S. state-building policy that we seem to have embarked on assistance to fragile states or state building in precisely those situations that often pose the largest obstacles to success and require the greatest commitments. That is, in a situation such as Iraq, after removing the central government, one faces both issues of how to create a legitimate government and how to essentially create anew state institutions. And so we have the kind of most demanding and difficult situation. In Afghanistan, initially, when the Karzai government came to power, we had a legitimate but weak state that needed help to become effective. But by failing to provide sustained assistance to help it become more effective in the early days, we now face in Afghanistan a situation where there is a state that has greatly reduced legitimacy, that remains extremely weak in terms of its capacity, and which is facing a rebellion in a substantial region. So if Iraq and Afghanistan are two of our major policy concerns, we seem to have bitten off two of the most difficult and taxing situations in which to give assistance. A situation like Georgia, where the government has had moderate legitimacy and needs to be reformed a bit to ensure that that legitimacy remains, and where the state has some capacity and simply needs some reinforcement to strengthen its ability to provide services, is an example of an easier case to perhaps assist a fragile state avoid moving toward a more serious breakdown. As I say, this just sets the broad framework, and I will turn it over to my colleagues to develop some more details on precise issues of policy and sequencing. And I will ask that you excuse me. I've had a bit of a back problem, and I will be standing off to the side because standing is better than sitting for me at this point. But I will certainly come back to the stage to answer questions when we get into the discussions. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. David?
My marching orders were fairly straightforward. One was to help you prioritize countries and entry points, and the other one was to have you leave this room less confused, hopefully, than when you came in, regarding concepts and terminology. I hope I can help you in the first area. I'm not sure I can contribute to the second area, because there are points of convergence between various research projects, but there are also concepts that I think we need to work through. I have a limited amount of time, so I'm going to gloss over some of the detail. The slideshow itself, I believe, will be available to you for downloading if you want to get into some greater detail. Okay, key findings from our research project: concepts and operationalization, correlations, causes, aid impact in small developing states. That's probably all I will have an opportunity to go through today. Jack Goldstone spoke briefly about failed and fragile states. We can see that fragile states are all-encompassing. They include weak states, collapsed states, failing and failed states, as well as some developing states and democratizing states. We like to think of fragile states as a process rather than an end state. And all states, even Canada and the United States, are to some extent fragile. But some states are obviously more fragile than others for reasons that I'll get to in a moment. If we look at fragility over time, there's 3 points that I want to stress here. This is a timeline or time series stretching back to 1980 to almost the current period. The red line is the overall measure of fragility, and then the green, blue, and purple lines are various aspects of that fragility, including authority, legitimacy, and capacity, which are more or less related to the effectiveness, legitimacy components that Jack Goldstone spoke of. What we can see here is the following. One is that fragility is increasing over time. Apart from a short blip post-1989 where there was a fundamental decrease in fragility, scores have increased over time. More importantly, what we're seeing is that there's a convergence, and this point will be reinforced later on when, if I have the opportunity to speak to a specific country tracking. But those scores, authority, legitimacy, and capacity scores, are converging over time. This is somewhat worrisome. The third point that I want to stress here, and one that is not nearly as obvious, is that the single largest predictor that a country will become fragile is its prior fragility experience. Now, that's not quite the same that as saying that a state that is failed will become failed later on, but it is close. So we need to determine, in other words, what are the various components that inform this tracking over time. It is worrisome. Our research project looks, as I said, at authority, legitimacy, and capacity indicators. I think we can be safe to assume that effectiveness, which Jack Goldstone spoke of, is a combination of authority and capacity. We've just parsed that out a little more in more detail. What we find in terms of our research agenda, and we have amassed a fairly sizable database, is that failure is most often associated with challenges to authority and capacity structures. This is more or less confirmed in the literature, regardless of which database you're using. The second point is that focusing aid on capacity can be effective. In other words, growth matters, regardless of whether a country is legitimate or not, or whether it has effective authority structures. Growth matters. But having said that, fragile states are both over and underfunded, and I have some graphics to make that point. The other point I want to stress is that a lot of the research on failed and fragile states tends to focus on conflict-driven factors, symptoms that are associated with large-scale war. But if we look at a unique set of subset of cases called small developing states, in particular small island developing states, what we find is that they have unique problems. And this is reinforced in the literature by, in particular, Paul Collier's book on the bottom billion. They have particular problems related to population size, arbitrary borders, and generally are small enough that they cannot overcome their growth problems. But they also don't experience large-scale conflict. What they have is chronic instability associated with urban violence and so on. So small states, for our purposes, require, I think, special attention, because they're usually off the radar screen when it comes to the research agenda. For example, you won't see in any conventional ranking of failed and fragile states, small states at the top of that list. Key findings include distinctions between fragility and failure, and this is a point that needs to be made. What's being reinforced in the literature is that states become fragile and fail for different reasons, and their entry points will be different as a result. Conflict is often a symptom, not a cause of fragility. Not all fragile states experience conflict, as I said, especially small developing states. Now, having said that, and I agree generally with what Jack Goldstone said regarding convergence in the literature, we do have to be sensitive to the fact that there are major research agendas out there that do have different working assumptions. There's the development perspective coming out of the World Bank, DFID, USAID, and so on. There's the conflict perspective, including Agenda for Peace, the Carnegie Commission, Fund for Peace, International Crisis Behavior Project, and so on. And then what I would call the stability perspective. All, despite the differences in assumptions about causes and consequences, they all generate more or less a similar list. In fact, if you look at the simple correlation matrix, you'll see that lining up the top 5 indicator lists, there's a strong correlation. LICUS is the Low-Income Countries Under Stress project out of the World Bank. Its focus is on economic indicators. What you'll see there is that it's the one that's least correlated with the other matrices, other correlations. But the Marshall Goldstone, Fund for Peace, Brookings, LICUS, and CIFP are all there, and they all correlate almost close to or above 0.7, in some cases 0.8. For example, the Brookings and CIFP, which bear strong similarity, correlate at 0.84. So despite the differences, as Professor Goldstone has already said, you do see strong relationships between these different projects. So this is my effort to contribute to your reduction in confusion. If you find yourself looking at different databases, I think you'll see that overall they do say more or less the same thing. But having said that, dependent variables are often defined differently, especially when they're defined in terms of failure. The dependent variable, that is what you're trying to measure. The outcome is usually violent end state or sometimes low capacity. The point of this symposium, as I understand it, is that we need a framework that anticipates much earlier turning points. We need to look at entry points, sequencing, and timing issues in advance of the onset of violent conflict. Once a state has reached large-scale violent conflict, your options are fairly limited. You're looking at operational responses, highly costly, are going to generate a lot of political ill will, and will require huge effort on the part of the intervening state. So by anticipating earlier turning points, one might be better prepared to prevent. That's the fundamental assumption of our project when we look at authority, legitimacy, and capacity. As I said, fragility is a process, not an end state. 3 fundamental components: authority, which is the ability to provide basic security within borders, institutional capacity to provide basic social needs for the populations, and political legitimacy to effectively represent their citizens at home and abroad. Now, if we look at the matrix for Pakistan, we can see that potential entry points include governance, economic security, crime, human development, demography, and environment. So more or less there is, again, a convergence with what we just heard. But here we have a scaling or an index that allows you to prioritize entry points according to the risks entailed. For example, the governance score for Pakistan shows red almost right across the board. Economics, much better performance. Security and crime, high-risk factors. Human development, high-risk factors, demography, and so on. I don't have the time to go into detail into these. But this is the beginning. These profiles are the beginning of a process of trying to engage a country and trying to establish priorities. All right. Similarities in indices. Here we have almost identical rankings relative to what you just heard, Afghanistan being the highest, but this is for 2007. More importantly, when we break our rankings down by authority, legitimacy, and capacity scores, what we end up with is a much more nuanced array of countries. For example, those facing authority challenges, very similar to the ranking we just heard, Sudan, Afghanistan, Iraq, DRC, these are the countries that we most often associate with high failure rates, the ones that are facing internal or external challenges to their authority structures. But if we look at legitimacy, now granted, of our three components, legitimacy is arguably the most normative. It speaks to human rights, it speaks to gender equity, it speaks to protection of the environment, and a variety of other things. Saudi Arabia, Libya, North Korea, Yemen Republic, Somalia, Iraq, United Arab Emirates, Turkmenistan, and so on round out the top of that list. Capacity, not surprisingly, bulk of those countries, sub-Saharan Africa. Burundi rounding out the top of that list. So what we're getting here is a more nuanced picture of the kind of fragility factors that are associated with each of these states. Tracking these figures over time, ALC components or authority, legitimacy, capacity scores over time shows us something very fundamental and very important. One is that here we have measures for Somalia, Pakistan, Zimbabwe, and Sri Lanka from 1960 to 2006. This is a panel database that we've compiled. Not only are their scores increasing over time, but they're converging. So one weakness seems to be contributing to the weakness in another area. The exception to this rule might be Sri Lanka, where you see a decline or improvement in its performance in the last several years. Yes, I know it's just resolved its civil war, but its economic performance has not been that bad. Here we can see similar measures for Sierra Leone, Yemen, Haiti, and the DRC. Again, increasing fragility scores over time with respect to authority, legitimacy, capacity. And by the way, those vertical lines refer to the Political Instability Task Force onset periods for state failure, and convergence of those three components over time. Now, time permitting, 5 minutes, let's look at some key findings. I want to speak to correlates as well as causes, but I may not have the opportunity to speak in some detail on those. Democracy, the panacea that we would all like to bring to countries around the world, perhaps, perhaps not. Here's the inverse U-curve with fragile states scoring highly clustered within the middle, but not surprisingly, they tend to be the most anacratic, which means they are vacillating between both democracy and authority structures. The least democratic states on the far right hand of the matrix are not necessarily the least fragile. Okay? So you've got an inverse U-curve here, which tells us problems in transitioning. Fragile states are not necessarily ones that are experiencing problems in democratization. But it's the high-level authority systems of the punitive systems on the right-hand side that are going to prove to be difficult to bring about change in with respect to democracy. Similar kind of relationship on human rights, inverse U-curve, but this relationship is not nearly as powerful when we put it through the model. But again, human rights, according to this particular index, ranked against our fragility scores, show that the most fragile states are not the ones with the most significant human rights violations. That's important, I think. That means that we have entry points for action. Correlates of fragility are finding, and I think this is reinforced in a lot of literature, focusing on growth is possibly the single biggest important aspect of development assistance. Capacity may well be the answer. Here we have the ranking of the fragility score against the Human Development Index. Those countries that are the most fragile have the highest or the poorest Human Development Index scores. Not all poor states are fragile. Perhaps that's an obvious point, but here we can see fragility ranked against the GDP per capita scores, and we can see that many states that are poor are not necessarily what we would consider to be fragile. Unfortunately, what we have here is the randomness of aid distribution. We would think, in a perfect world, that the states that are lowest in capacity and also most fragile would be getting the bulk of the aid. That is not supported in our research. And there's reasons for that, which will be probably alluded to later in the research. But our basic research finding is that growth matters. Most highly significant factors, the level of development, robust to a barrage of tests, including a variety of different procedures. Other variables as specified above are also significant within the expected direction. Income inequality does not matter when compared to the level of development. I will go into some causes, but I would like to say that when we developed a model including income growth, level democracy, trade openness, infant mortality, a robust finding in the literature that's been around for almost 15 years now, there's strong support when that model is tested against our own index. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to stop there because I think I've run out of time. There are other issues related to volatility and capacity, orphans and darlings, as well as issues related to small developing states. I just wanted to conclude with this particular point, which is that there are countries receiving aid far in excess of what they should be receiving in terms of what's effective amount of aid to receive, 15% of the gross national income, and there are states that are receiving far less than what they should be receiving given their poor performance. I can speak to trade-offs, but I don't think I have time to speak to that. But the point here is that these states are not using aid effectively precisely because they don't have the capacity to absorb that aid and use it properly. Burundi, Afghanistan are the aid darlings, with other countries like Sudan and Togo off the radar screen. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This will be a big challenge for Monty to stay within the time limit. But he's got 7 minutes, 10 minutes.
I better get going then. It'll take me the most time trying to figure out how to get my presentation up here.
That's a good point.
All right. Let's see. I don't know if I exit. It's on the front screen. And mine is this one, I think. All right, hey. And that's the one that starts it. Okay. Well, this doesn't match the title in your agenda because I didn't receive the agenda until last night. I was going to put it in there, but hey, this is what I'm really talking about, which is the same as what it says in the agenda. So it's just my words. I'm going to talk from a macro systemic point of view about the problem of fragile and failed states, but focusing mainly on the main problem in this venue is that the outbreak of violent conflict, which tends to tear everything down. It feeds back into the fragility. It's fed by the fragility. It feeds back into the fragility, and we get a locking cycle. That fragile states remain fragile mainly because they can't manage their situations properly, and the mismanagement of the situation actually causes a further deterioration in their future ability to manage. Now, there should be a learning curve, but there are certain impediments to this learning curve. Now, first, I want to preface my remarks by giving this what I think is a great summary of what we're dealing with. And this is looking at ecosystems, but it's got some very salient points. All ecosystems are exposed to gradual changes, and nature is usually assumed to respond to gradual change in a smooth way. That's great. However, smooth change can be interrupted by sudden drastic switches to a contrasting state, and that's what we're focusing on here. Although diverse events can trigger such shifts, recent studies show that a loss of resilience usually paves the way for a switch to this alternative, this negative state. This suggests that strategies for sustainable management of ecosystems should focus on building and maintaining resilience. Stability domains typically depend on slowly changing variables. These factors may be predicted, monitored, and modified. In contrast, stochastic events that trigger state shifts are usually difficult to predict or control. And that's the real issue here. That if it gets to this point, this crisis condition, that even our best efforts and our best intentions can actually produce counterproductive outcomes. And it's very difficult to predict what is going to happen in these very quickly moving and quickly changing situations. So, how best how to best to deal with these, what's the best strategy for interceding to try and affect the course of these events. Well, looking at it from the macro-systemic context, there are two elements here that need to be paid attention to. One is the society, which is usually neglected from a policy of assistance point of view. Society runs best when there's coherence and cohesiveness. This is based in well-functioning and vibrant social networks, based on myriad associational ties and dense interactions. And these have to be cross-cutting. They can't coincide. They have to overlap in order to build a very resilient social network. Now, impediments to setting up this resilient network are basically size issues, area, large populations, poor endowments, physical endowments, diversity within the territories of this systemic unit, and the level of technologies either available to them or the skill set to utilize those technologies. Now, the other important component is the system itself. And this is really the state, embodied in the state. And there are two elements here. The state formation. A state can't really fail until you actually have a functioning state. And in the many situations that we're dealing with, there's never been a truly functioning state that has full authority and capacity over its entire territory. Talking about failure in those situations are partial failures. So the state is only partially operating. And it really needs to get to the point where it's a fully functioning state before we can really deal with it in a coherent way. And then there's the performance issues. Once the state is set up, how does it perform, and can it maintain this link, this vital link to a coherent and cohesive society? Now, the management, this is all about management then. Management needs to be inclusive, representative, responsive, accountable, and it has to have the proper mix of what I call associational versus instrumental strategies. Associational are based on cooperation. Instrumental strategies are based on coercion. Either type, legitimate or coercive strategies, can aid performance and effectiveness, but we want to move towards greater reliance on associational strategies because instrumental strategies actually help create the conditions that we're trying to avoid. And they're a last resort situation. Problems, capture of the state. If a subgroup within a society can capture the state, it will distort the performance of the state and create unequal distribution or functioning and distorted associations and interactions. Ignorance, of course, is a problem. Incompetence, obviously. But marginalization, I'm going to come back to this issue. And polar factionalism, which is where I'm going to focus most of my remarks. Prospects, we have to account for, as David prefaced fairly well, that we have risk factors. And then we also have resilience factors. And the interplay between these two really determines the outcome. And I'll illustrate this in a further slide. So the topic, polar, what I call macro-factionalism, gives us insights into political dynamics, which is really where policy intervenes or intercedes to try and alter the course of events. And most importantly, we now have a democracy-predominant system, and most of what we know is from an autocracy-dominant system. So our learning is really qualified in that we only have about 15 years of really knowledge on how a democracy-dominant system actually operates. Well, to put factionalism into context, these are onsets of war, civil war situations. I have 138 in between 1955 and 2008. And this is the polity scale, which David, again, nicely prefaced for me, so you have some exposure to it. Autocracy is on the left side. Democracy is on the right side, and it gets more democratic the farther you go right, and more autocratic at the farther you left. And then this little section over here are special situations. Independence, minus 88 is transitions, minus 77 is collapse of state government, minus 66 is a foreign occupation. But you'll see that factionalism, which is the red, is really associated with democratizing states. Now, autocratic states, factionalism doesn't seem to be a problem, but that's an illusion, and it's mainly due to the autocratic nature of the regime. There's factionalism that's being managed autocratically through coercive and repression. The factionalism being repressed in these situations. So factionalism really is at the root of the problem of the decision to use violence to settle political disputes. This minus 7, which is where most of the onsets are regimes where you have a personalistic leader, usually a military leader. And that seems to be the target of most outbreaks of warfare. So how do we situate factionalism? Well, we have a process, and this is what polity does. It measures these factors. And in democracies, most political interaction is based on conventional politics. It's deliberative, it's cooperative, it's coordinated. Coming up with common solutions and implementing them. It can raise to contentious politics, which makes it a little bit more difficult to get things done, as we know. Can escalate to issue factionalism, which really divides the population or society along particular issues of disagreement where they can't find a solution. But democracies can carry a number of these issue dividing policies. The problem is when you get an accumulation of issue divisions that then start to be reflected in ideological divisions, polar factionalism. Groups are separating on what they think needs to be done, and they're in disagreement over the proper course to correct these situations. And they become less and less cooperative. They become more contentious as far as the strategy and the policies to pursue to fix this. If that further escalates, it goes into militancy, which is a coercive attempt to resolve that unresolvable conflict. And at that point, it's very likely to escalate further into open warfare. And when it escalates to further open warfare, then we have a fragmentation of the polity. The polity no longer is cohesive. It separates into contending factions. So we have two processes that are always in play in political process, in political dynamics. Democratization, which are the blue arrows that push politics back into conventional parameters. Autocratization, which pushes the dynamics towards greater militancy, coercion. Now, also important is the lower. It says rational choice and the emotion quotient. Rationality is predominant on the left side. Emotion becomes very, very potent as we move to the left. And emotion, as we know, is one factor that's very unpredictable, and it's almost in its extreme is impervious to reason. Why is this important? Well, looking at polar factionalism and the relationship between democracy and autocracy as an expression of political dynamics, polar factionalism is where autocracies find their equilibrium point. They manage political dynamics by managing factionalism, but in the process, they reinforce and reproduce the factionalism. The factionalism is never remedied under autocracy. In order to transition to democracy, countries have to deal with this internal factionalism, which is dividing the society that they're supposed to govern effectively. Now, the political problem of democracy is that once you get political dynamics to conventional politics, you need to manage it at the furthest extent. Never let it get beyond issue factionalism. Always find solutions in time that you can drive every political issue back down into conventional processes. In autocratic authority, the imperative is this red X, is to manage the political dynamics to where it never gets beyond the level of militancy, but you never get cohesion in militant groups where they can actually confront the state and fight the state over political control. So if you can do that, then these will maintain an equilibrium and will maintain over time.
2 minutes, maybe?
2 minutes. Well, I might get that 2 minutes. 5 minutes. Performance is the main instrument to maintain a democratic state, repression, an autocratic state. Looking at the relationship, state fragility, political instability, state failure, they are cumulative. They're not the same process, but they feed into one another and feed back into one another. Research shows that we have now, because we have a democracy-dominant state, we have two types of factionalism. One is the one that existed at state formation is maintained by autocracy and actually explains why autocracies emerge in weak and new states and developing states. And then we have processual factionalism, which emerges from a democratic process, which is really a distortion of the democracy. The outcomes are generally that there's a crackdown on the opposition, which drives the political dynamics back further into autocratic patterns, and in about half of those cases, an escalation into open warfare. The 25 is a situation where there's actually a consolidation, which is a remedy of the factionalism, and democratization actually occurs. Factionalism that emerges from democracy is highly unlikely to escalate all the way to open warfare, so that's a good thing. It can lead to a reversion to autocracy, but there's also a third possibility in that the state actually gets locked in a situation of basically dysfunctionalism, where it maintains factional politics through various means, but it can't really consolidate democracy, and it can't really institute a strong autocracy. This is just to confuse you, because this is what actually happens in political dynamics. It's not a dyadic thing where you go from one state to another. You go through a series of processes, and the end states are the geometric things. There's different options or different possibilities for outcomes, but these four squares, numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, are the intercession points. And what I would say are the appropriate types of intercessions. One is the resilience of the state itself. Facing a challenge, resilience should be able to meet that challenge and manage the situation short of a radical or extreme outcome. If it lacks the resilience to actually manage its own affairs, its second course is the neighboring states. If the neighboring states are providing it positive assistance or a positive environment, this is going to help and supplement the resilience of the state itself, and again help to it respond positively and effectively to challenges. If, however, it gets into a more complicated condition, it may lose the capacity to resolve its own problems through its own resiliency, and it requires then regional support, or in the most extreme cases, it actually requires global support from the strongest actors. Now, this is to say to you, as the strongest actors, like, you shouldn't be involved in all these situations if you're actually incrementally fostering resilience in states. You are actually doing the job to help, the best strategy for managing these situations. And then you are left only with the extreme cases, which should not overly tax your ability to respond. You can't get involved in all ways, in all places. It needs to be a very complex set of intercessions to help manage these situations. This is the good news. Contrary to what David said, where he says fragility is increasing, our measure, which is the lower left, says that there's been a 20% decrease in fragility. And this complements a 60% reduction in armed conflict in the global system, and up in the upper right, an enormous increase in the use of democracy to govern states within the system. And the lower one shows you where the concentrations of the most fragile states are. So there is good news, in my opinion. You can certainly debate that or argue about it. But my last slide, Michael, what I think is the best thing that can be done, number one, increase resilience. And I would go a step farther than what Michael is talking about and do a whole of system approach, which is not only focusing on states and institutions, but looking at society as a whole and doing whatever it takes to actually increase the development of associations in civil society and the density of interactions with those, and make sure those associations are cross-cutting. Accountability guarantees rather than security guarantees. I think the most important thing the outside and the developed world can do is to provide accountability guarantees for states, because that's what they lack the most, and they can't even hold themselves accountable in most cases when there's high fragility. Evidence of this, election assistance and monitors, absolutely extremely important in our new democracy-dominant world system, and engagement in mediation, equally important to explaining the good things that I just argued are happening in the world system since the end of the Cold War. Lesson resilience on instrumental strategies. This is the other side to the accountability guarantees as opposed to security guarantees. Security guarantees only as a last resort in situations that are out of control. Security sector reform, another thing that I can point out as extremely important, explaining the positive progress in the system and the professionalization of the military. Number one, in preventing the crackdown and the outbreak of open warfare is to keep the military in the barracks until the emotion quotient, which is the last one, dissipates within social forces, the masses. The masses will get riled up, but they will calm themselves down eventually, if not confronted by a show of extreme coercion. If they're allowed to operate within the system, they generally will. And, of course, to help to deal with the problem of marginalization, which giving stakes to groups, because the groups that have no stakes in the system are the most likely to challenge the system and try and change it through coercive means. I'll end my remarks there.
Thanks, Monty. You actually did get the program a little earlier, but anyway. I think there's plenty to sink our teeth in here. Maybe some of you want to ask questions about sort of basic clarifications. Some of you are curious about some of the concepts. Let's open it up here. And I'm going to take several questions at a time. And if you could briefly identify yourself and then indicate if there is someone you want to ask it of, say so, please. Yes, sir.
My name is Dan Kazmer. I'm a research associate with the Institute for European Russia.
If you could wait for the mic, and if you could, everyone pass over the mic quickly.
My name is Dan Kazmer. I'm a research associate with the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at George Washington University. My questions are for Professor Marshall. One is, if you were to take your view of autocracy versus democracy and apply it historically, I'm thinking of the U.S. Civil War, how does that work out? And the other is, resilience often comes with being tested over and over again and learning to overcome greater and greater challenges. Could you say something about how that can be done? In other words, a system that's not tested will not be resilient. If you comment on those issues.
Other questions? Lawrence, and then this lady, please.
Lawrence Wuscher, U.S. Institute of Peace. Just wondering if David and Monty could comment to try and help us explain the difference in your findings about the trends in fragility over time.
Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Yolande Miller-Guanvo from the Office of Education at USAID. I have a question for David. Have you unpacked the concept of capacity? Have you broken it down into further elements? And if so, would you mind talking about that a little bit? Thank you.
Okay, a little low on the questions, so, all right, one more, John, please, in the back. John Sewell.
It's on now. Okay, good. Thanks. I just wanted to raise a question which is both for David Carman and Monty Marshall. It's the emphasis on growth, because, David, I heard you link growth both to human development and to capacity. And obviously, they're different things. You can have a lot of human development, not have much capacity, and not too much growth. And similarly, Monty, I didn't see economic growth show up in your presentation. I may have missed it or been wrong. If so, I'm sorry. But it seems to me that there's a lot of data that says when you get to a certain point of per capita income, the possibility of fragmentation and conflict starts diminishing rather rapidly. So I'd just be curious to get a response to that.
All right. Monty, I think you're first.
Okay, to respond to the first question, giving the U.S. as an example in the Civil War situation is the perfect example of this escalation through these stages. And we can trace that. We talk about this a lot in the task force. Jack and I are both members of the task force. We've been doing this for too many years. Well, no, not too many years. Not enough years, but it seems like too many. Yeah, it's long to 15 years, right? Something like that for you, 12 for me. That is the perfect example of how democracy can move to this polar factionalism, the division between the North and the South, and how this then almost presupposes the system to break apart. And, of course, in that case, then this decision whether to use force to put it back together. Lincoln, we applaud for putting it back together. Milosevic, we condemn for trying to put it back together. Situational context can change. The other example from the U.S. is recently the civil rights and the anti-war movement, where the U.S. almost got to the point of polar factionalism, and I've also often pointed out that it's the Kent State situation, where it's the actual obvious use of militancy and the backlash from that experience that actually moved the U.S. back towards conventional politics. And we see these dynamics in all the countries of the world, and non-fragile states find ways to manage these situations and prevent the worst outcomes. There's a learning curve, and that was the other part of the question. And by not interceding in the dynamics themselves, you actually are expecting countries to learn how to manage their conflicts. And they will fail on occasion, and failure is not necessarily a problem. It is actually part of the learning situation. And when countries learn that if they don't manage their conflict properly, and they do experience onsets of instability, then it raises the incentives to learn how to manage things properly. If someone comes in and fixes the situation, they have no incentive to learn how to manage it properly, and you'll see them locked in this situation. They're constantly failing to manage, mainly because they never learned that it's necessary. And you can think of your own kids when you think of that situation, because that's what happens. You have to back off and let them figure it out. David, you want to explain to them why your trends are increasing?
Wait. Or why your trends are decreasing.
Well, I'll handle that.
Okay, well, it's very simple. But I'm not going to tell you why I think the state fragility index / PITF index shows a decrease, but rather YR shows an increase. I think it's related to the way we measure fragility, which is not simply tied to events of a violent nature, whether it's revolutionary war, genocide, ethnic rebellion, and so on. We're not just tapping into the political realm, but also the economic realm. Our database, if you will, I didn't show you this correlation, but it correlates very highly with the Human Development Index. I think most fragile states indices do correlate highly with the Human Development Index. What's that mean then? Economic growth is a very strong indicator of increasing fragility. This is a roundabout way of saying that I don't think that's what the Fragile States Index is measuring. I think they're measuring events related to large-scale conflict and internal challenges to authority structures primarily, and secondarily issues regarded to legitimacy, capacity perhaps being an area which would require further attention were one to show an increase over time. The data that I think Monty showed is consistent with the larger literature on tracking armed conflict over the last 30 years. So there's no surprise in that downturn. But if we're interested in issues of fragility beyond, I think, large-scale conflict, and maybe I'm reading into too much what you've done, or challenges to authority structures, then we probably, I think what we've got here is a worrisome trend regarding upward swings in fragility since the end of the Cold War. This has been documented, as you know, by Paul Collier's work and others at the World Bank, and I guess you could say we are more in line, if you will, with the economic perspectives on fragility regarding the presence of huge inequities between states and within them, the bottom billion, if you will. Having said that, the question regarding equity issues or Amartya Sen's measure of human development more broadly as opposed to simply growth models, our testing focuses primarily on growth as opposed to questions regarding human development broadly defined. If you were to take those juxtaposed interpretations of what development should be, this goes back to the question that was asked at the back. Our findings really reinforce the point that capacity is largely associated with decreasing measures of fragility. But the fundamental problem, which I didn't get a chance to really address in detail, is that fragile states en masse are generally not only likely to be underfunded because they lack the correct policy environments, and this goes back to huge debate within the development literature regarding whether or not aid selectivity should be a priority. They lack the right policy environment to begin with. So we wouldn't expect them to be able to use that investment wisely or properly. But not only is our fragile states underfunded en masse, although we saw cases where they are extremely overfunded, which probably doesn't serve any real purpose. I think it's close to 50% of the gross national income for Burundi is coming from the donor community. Take that away, and you've got serious problems. The second point is that aid volatility is an issue. So there's a question of whether aid is being delivered on a regular and continuous and in a concerted way, focusing on these most fragile states. So over the last, our data, which I didn't get a chance to go into, shows that basically fragile states are underfunded relative to the larger set of cases of IDA recipients, but also that they're more likely to be victims of aid volatility or the whims of the donor community. On the question of how we measure capacity, I would say it's a combination without revealing any of our specific indicators. I'm more than happy to share that with you. There's a book we have coming out which will specify those measures. We could walk through it if you wanted to look at the Pakistan profile. It's a combination of economic and social capital. The reference to service delivery, I think, is very important. The British focus on service delivery instead of capacity. We see service delivery as a combination of authority and capacity. It's not enough to have access or the ability to extract resources. You need to effectively allocate them, which is a function of authority. So you've got this. I think there's a huge convergence in the literature, despite this worrisome difference in the trend lines, which I think can be really easily explained. There's a convergence in the literature. I'm very pleased to see that more or less, which is what Michael Lund wanted us to tell you, that we are more or less on the same plane.
Michael, can I address these as well?
Yeah. We got about 3 or 4 minutes.
Thanks. A few quick points on these institutions and measures. I think it's important to keep in mind that the institutions, whether it's democracy, social service, or economic growth, institutions serve as tools for addressing conflict. If it's the case that the major political actors in society are not interested in resolving conflicts or managing them because they have a zero-sum view of those conflicts and their goal is to dominate the society and exclude their competitors, then any institutions, democratic institutions, liberal institutions, rule of law institutions, will either be abused or destroyed in the efforts of those groups to take over. So the United States, which started with terrific institutions at the beginning of the 19th century, had those institutions break down as the polarization over slaveholding grew more acute. And in any country where those, I think this is the point of Monty's presentation, one has to look at how the major actors approach their conflict, whether they approach it in a polarized zero-sum fashion or whether they are seriously interested in moving toward compromise. Howard mentioned his Democratic Leaders Program. We have some research at the Political Instability Task Force that's starting to find that the key element in whether a fragile state avoids collapse is often whether or not major opposition leaders can achieve some kind of agreements, some kinds of compromises. That is generally what seems to head off this greater deterioration, even in a difficult institutional setting. The difference in these measures, I think, is indeed easy to reconcile. If one measures fragility more in terms of economic advance and state authority in the poorest states, in Collier's bottom billion countries, the poorest states have been falling behind relative to the faster growing and richer ones. And from that perspective, things are getting worse. On the other hand, if you look globally overall, a number of areas of major polarizing ethnic and regional conflicts in the 90s, West Africa, Burundi, Rwanda, the Balkans, South Asia. In a number of those areas, new agreements or arrangements have been reached that have provided some institutional breakthroughs toward greater democracy. They're certainly not established and stable. They still have degrees of fragility, but certainly compared to the breakdown of institutions and open conflict that raged in those areas in the 90s, we see progress not just in the cessation of conflict, but in the development of institutions that work more toward conflict management. In that sense, you get a view of greater stability, less fragility. So a lot of the difference is emphasis. But still, if you look at which countries show up the worst in the world, there's quite a lot of agreement on that point.
Yeah, have 1 minute for rebuttal.
All right. Are you going to destroy the convergence that we've wonderfully arrived at?
No. I'm going to help the convergence by explaining what the difference is. And the state fragility measure was developed to complement the PITF. It's not the PITF model. The PITF model actually shows that there's an increase in the number of at-risk states. So the challenges to states seems to be increasing. But their resilience seems also to be increasing. It's the only thing that seems to explain the drop-off in the problems. At the same time, we have an increase in the challenges. There's something going on, and Andy Mack at the Human Security Report has been grappling with this, trying to explain it himself. And there's different ways to explain it, but the correlation, the last question, the correlation between GDP per capita and our state fragility measure is 0.75. The economic development is extremely important in building capacity in states, and that has been improving. At the same time, the experience with war also is positively correlated with fragility at about 0.45. That warfare does increase fragility, and we need to put an end to those. And the end of warfare actually does improve the fragility situation quite tremendously. And the human capital, there's also been, as pointed out, great strides in that. And so we have a confluence between economic development and human development, which is really what explains largely our improvement in state fragility.
And I want to raise a point that will lead to the next session, really. This has been a very abstract session. We've talked broadly about capacity, legitimacy, authority, and this may seem pointless to those of you who are concerned with what do we actually do to help fragile states. But I think it's very important to keep these concepts in mind, because if one just walks away with a list of measures, it's all too easy to get bound up in that list. And if I'm planning policy for Afghanistan and I want to improve its fragility measure, it may be very hard to rein in warlords, but it may be possible to mobilize resources to attack drug smuggling. So if I figure I can improve the fragility matrix by working on attacking drug smuggling, I may go off and do that. But the reality is, if you're not keeping in mind the broader concept of legitimacy, you enter a situation where, from the perspective of the people in Afghanistan, you're not protecting them from warlord depredations. You're essentially attacking and destroying a part of the livelihood of a part of the population. So how do these measures actually, how do these policies actually advance legitimacy? So I do think these notions, legitimacy, capacity, authority, it's important to keep the substance of those things in mind when asking what do we do first, what measures will actually help a state become less fragile.
Thank you. That was a nice summary statement. I was going to try to come up with one, but that does very well. So let's break for 15 minutes and get back here right at 10 of, please.
This difference.